A promise kept by Evelyn Merrick. The autumn breeze danced through Cedar Creek, carrying with it the sweet scent of ripening apples and freshly harvested wheat. Lila Montgomery adjusted her shawl as she walked along the dirt road, her boots leaving delicate impressions in the dusty earth. At 27, she carried herself with a quiet grace that turned heads, though she remained seemingly oblivious to the attention she drew. The small town hadn't changed much over the years, the same weathered buildings, the same familiar faces, the same rhythm of life that moved with the seasons. Yet lately Lila felt as though time was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Her younger sister Mary had married 2 summers ago, and was expecting her second child, while Lila remained unmarried, a fact that drew knowing looks and well-meaning but unwanted advice from the townspeople. "You can't wait forever, dear," Mrs. Peterson had said just that morning at the general store, her voice thick with concern. "There are plenty of fine young men who'd be lucky to have you." Lila had simply smiled and changed the subject, but the words echoed in her mind as she made her way to the post office. She didn't need reminding that most girls in Cedar Creek were married by 20 and had started families by 25. But Lila held fast to the stories her mother had shared about meeting her father, tales of a love so deep it had transformed both their lives. She wanted that kind of connection, not just a marriage of convenience. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Lila approached the post office. She paused, taking in the view of the distant hills where the trees were beginning to show hints of gold and crimson. The sight had always brought her peace, but today it stirred something else in her heart, a mixture of longing and hope she couldn't quite name. The creak of the post office door drew her attention, and she turned to see a tall figure emerging into the sunlight. He wore a travel-worn coat, and his hat was pulled low, but there was something achingly familiar about the way he moved. When he lifted his head and their eyes met, Lila's heart seemed to stop beating entirely. "Samuel?" The name left her lips in a whisper, carried away by the autumn wind. Samuel Tucker stood before her, no longer the impetuous young man who had left Cedar Creek 5 years ago, in search of adventure and fortune. His face was weathered by sun and wind, and his shoulders were broader than she remembered. But his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had once made her young heart flutter, remained unchanged. "Lila," he said softly, removing his hat. "I hardly dared hope you'd still be here." The words struck her like a physical force. How many times had she imagined this moment? How many nights had she lain awake, wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he ever thought of her? Yet now that he stood before her, she found herself at a loss for words. "Where else would I be?" she finally managed, striving for a lightness she didn't feel. "Cedar Creek is home." A shadow of regret crossed his face. "Yes, it is. I just took a long time to realize that." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Samuel gestured toward the river path. "Would you walk with me? I'd like to tell you about my travels, if you're willing to listen." Lila hesitated, but her curiosity, and something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name, won out. They fell into step together, following the familiar path that went down to the riverbank, where they had spent countless hours as children. As they walked, Samuel spoke of his adventures of the gold fields in California, the vast ranches in Montana, the growing cities of the Oregon Territory. He painted pictures with his words of majestic mountains, endless prairies, and opportunities that seemed to stretch as far as the horizon. But there was something in his voice, a note of wistfulness that caught Lila's attention. "It sounds wonderful," she said when he finished. "Why did you come back?" Samuel stopped walking and turned to face her. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of pink and gold, casting a warm glow over his features. "Because none of it meant anything without someone to share it with. Because every sunset I saw, every new place I discovered, made me think of you." Lila's heart jumped, but she forced herself to remain still. "You never wrote," she said quietly. "Not one letter in 5 years." "I started 100 letters," he admitted, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so familiar it made her ache. "But every time I tried to put words to paper, they seemed inadequate. How could I tell you that I was a fool for leaving? That I thought I needed to prove something to myself, to the world, when everything I really needed was right here." "And now?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you looking for now, Samuel?" He took a step closer, and Lila could see the sincerity in his eyes. "A chance to make things right. To build a life here with you, if you'll have me. I'm not asking for an answer today, but I want you to know that I'm staying. Whether you choose to be part of my future or not, Cedar Creek is my home." The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality. Samuel found work at the blacksmith shop, where his strong hands and quick mind made him an invaluable addition. Each evening, he would wait for Lila after she finished helping at the schoolhouse, and they would walk together through the town. Slowly, carefully, they rebuilt their friendship. Samuel shared stories of his travels. But now Lila could hear what he hadn't said before. The loneliness, the growing realization that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. In turn, she told him about the changes in Cedar Creek, about teaching the town's children, about her dreams of building a life filled with purpose and love. As autumn deepened into winter, Samuel proved himself to be more than just the restless boy who had left years ago. He helped elderly Mrs. Wilson repair her roof before the first snow, taught the younger children how to care for horses at the stable, and became a fixture at town meetings where his experiences out west provided valuable insights. But it was the quiet moments that truly won Lila's heart, the way he remembered she loved wildflowers and would bring her tiny bouquets, how he listened intently when she spoke of her hopes for the school, the gentle way he helped her over icy patches on their evening walks. The turning point came during the winter social at the town hall. The room was warm and bright with lanterns, filled with the sound of fiddles and laughter. Samuel had just finished helping to serve hot cider when the musicians struck up a familiar waltz. "May I have this dance?" he asked, extending his hand to Lila. As they moved across the floor, Samuel held her as if she were made of porcelain, precious and delicate. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the first time we danced together? At your sister's wedding?" Lila nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She remembered everything about that night, the way he had looked at her, the dreams she had harbored, the pain when he left shortly after. "I was afraid then," he continued, his voice low and meant only for her. "Afraid that if I stayed, I'd never know what else life had to offer. But I've learned something in my travels, Lila. Life isn't about the places you go or the things you do, it's about the people you share it with." He drew her closer, and Lila could feel the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," he whispered. "I think I always have, even when I was too foolish to realize it. I know I hurt you when I left, and I'll spend the rest of my life making up for that, if you'll let me." Lila looked up into his eyes, seeing in them everything she had ever wanted: love, commitment, and the promise of a shared future. "I love you too," she said softly. "I think I was waiting for you all along." Their wedding took place the following spring, when the apple trees were heavy with blossoms and the air was sweet with promise. They exchanged vows by the river where they had played as children, where they had reunited, where they had finally found their way back to each other. Lila wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried a bouquet of wildflowers Samuel had gathered that morning. As they built their life together, Samuel proved that his wandering days were truly behind him. He took over the blacksmith shop when old Mr. Turner retired, expanding it to serve the growing needs of the town. Lila continued teaching, and together they created a home filled with love, laughter, and the patter of little feet. Years later, their children would ask to hear the story of how their parents fell in love. Lila would smile at Samuel across the room, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. It wasn't just a story of love found, lost, and found again. It was a testament to the power of patience, forgiveness, and the courage to believe in second chances. For in the end, Lila had gotten exactly what she had waited for, not just a husband but a true partner, someone who understood that the greatest adventures are the ones shared with the person you love. Samuel had found what he had traveled so far to discover, that sometimes the most precious treasures are the ones you left behind. And every evening as they sat together on their porch watching the sun set over Cedar Creek, they knew with absolute certainty that some promises are meant to be kept, and some loves are worth waiting for.